All right. Well, welcome everybody. We are so excited to see so many names, both new and old, joining us tonight. For those of you who are new to our program, my name is Anne Ferdig, and I am the co-director for Jane Austen and Company. Tonight, I am joined by my lovely co-hosts, Dr. Inga Brody and Dr. Susan Allen Ford, as well as our wonderful technical director, Malika Amoroso. So thank you so much for joining us, and we are just so delighted to get things going tonight.
Yes, and welcome to our sixth installment, or penultimate installment in our Reading with Jane Austen series. And today we're so delighted to have Stuart Bennett come and talk to us about bookbinding from Aphra Behn to Jane Austen.
Yes, it's my pleasure to welcome Stuart Bennett. Stuart is an antiquarian bookseller in Charleston, South Carolina. He's past president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, and in the more distant past, a Christie's auctioneer in London. I know Stuart from an essay he published in Persuasions in 2013 on Lord Moira and the Austens, a fascinating account of one of the patrons of the naval Austen brothers and someone whose large debts were partly responsible for Henry Austen's bankruptcy. His many publications, that's Stuart's many publications, include Trade Bookbinding in the British Isles, 1660 to 1800, from which some of the material in this talk derives, and 4 novels. Most recently, The Charleston Gambit, a historical novel set during the Revolutionary War in South Carolina, and also The Perfect Visit, a bibliographical romance with a cameo appearance by Jane Austen. And I'm now going to hand things over to Malika to explain the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. So please feel free throughout the talk to put your questions for Stuart in the Q&A box, which should be located at the bottom center of your screen. Please make sure to put those in the Q&A box and not the chat, because if you put them in the chat, then our panelists won't be able to see them. So use that Q&A box.
All right. Thank you so much, Malika. And without further ado, let's hand things off to Stuart Bennett.
Thank you, everyone. Here comes the slide, the beginning of the slideshow. There we go. When I worked for Christie's auctioneers in London in the 1970s, one of my book department jobs was to respond to summonses from our representatives all over the country, especially when they asked for advice on private libraries. One day, the Edinburgh representative and I went to a Scottish earl's country house where we were shown some handsome bookcases full of fairly standard leather-bound sets. We complimented them and were on our way out when one of the maids came running after us. I can still remember her voice. "Oh, Mr. Bennett, we've found some more books." So back we went. The books were in cupboards by the kitchen, randomly stacked and mostly in paper bindings. We'd already seen the nice leather in the bookcases. I poked around a bit and came upon volume 3 of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, the first edition, 1811. Looked like this. But it was only volume 3. And young as I was, I'd found enough odd volumes in my time not to hold out much hope of completing the set. But after 20 minutes, I found volume 2 and another 10 turned up volume 1. They all had their printed spine labels, and the set looked like this. The Edinburgh rep and I took them in triumph to the Earl and Countess. I told them these were the most valuable books I'd seen in the house, that they were almost as new in the original paper boards as issued at the time, and that no doubt one of their ancestors had bought this first Jane Austen novel when it came out, hadn't cared for it, put it in the cupboard instead of sending it out for a nice leather binding, and never bought another Jane Austen novel. There was an icy silence. After a moment, the Countess said, "I am sure, Mr. Bennett, that our ancestors would never have felt that way about Jane Austen. Of course, there are other reasons this set might have found its way into those cupboards. But for our purposes, which is inquiring into the bookbindings put on English novels from Aphra Behn's time to Jane Austen's, what matters is that this set of Sense and Sensibility was in the cheapest possible publisher's binding. In modern times, revered as the closest one can come to absolutely original condition, comparable to great 1920s novels in original dust jackets. The usual phrase for this look is uncut for the untrimmed edges in the original boards. Can we back up to the previous slide? There we go. So how did these fragile bits of paper and cardboard come to be the basic presentation for publishers of English novels in the 18 teens? I'm going to look for answers by giving you some idea of the progression of English bookbinding and its connection with book publishing. I have a few more introductory remarks to make, and then I'm going to offer an illustrated chronology. How did pre-industrial English bookbinders come to work with booksellers in an era where hundreds of sheets of the same books were produced within a short time and had to be individually and laboriously bound? This relationship between bookbinders and booksellers is an aspect of the history of the book trade that has traditionally received little attention. In fact, for most of the last 100 years, it was assumed by scholars of English bookbindings that booksellers and bookbinders operated their businesses completely independently. In other words, if someone bought a book in 17th or 18th century England, he or she got a stack of unbound sheets. And as the eminent English authority Miriam Foote put it in her 1993 book, Studies in the History of Bookbinding, I quote, "It was the task of the owner to get them bound." I bring up this point because some of you watching may have been taught this. If you were, please let go of it. There's no doubt that some books were specially bound to order. Some well-to-do customers wanted their books, including novels, to look uniform on their shelves. And of course, special fancy binding were commissioned for special fancy books. But research over the last 30 years or so by scholars like David Pearson in England, and if I say it myself, my own 2004 book, Trade Bookbinding in the British Isles, have made clear that from the early days of British bookselling, at least 80% of books were sold to retail customers already bound. You can see these bound books in a picture slide of James Lackington's sprawling London bookshop around 1795, the largest shop in town. That's the end of that slide. We'll come to Aphra Behn in a minute. It's clear, however, that ready-bound books were not available to the same extent in Europe. A little-known letter from a German visitor to England in 1710 sums up the difference. The visitor was named Zacharias Conrad von Uffenbach, and he wrote from Oxford in August 1710. "As it was still early, we went to a bookshop and bought some books, mostly in English, such as are not to be had either in Holland or Germany. Books are so dear in England that the poorest duodecimo volume costs 18 pence or 2 shillings, over half a Reichsthaler. The best point is that in the booksellers' shops here, one buys neatly bound volumes and never sees unbound books, and all are in neat calf leather, such as English books are renowned for. Not only can one use the books immediately, but one can also inspect them beforehand in the shops, though for the most part, the English are not so minute. Indeed, Herr Karger assured me on his word of honor that he'd seen an Englishman purchase a yard of books as they stood, because that was the exact amount blank in his bookshelf at home." In other words, the English book trade was organized enough to be supplying ready-bound books to buyers in a way the continental trade wasn't. This organization of the book trade was the reason why, over the 150 or so years I'm primarily talking about, there was a gradual shift in the least expensive retail ready-bound book bindings from leather to those original boards you've just seen on Sense and Sensibility. The driving force behind this shift, you won't be surprised to hear, was money. Booksellers, and back then the term booksellers also meant publishers, ran the show. Not only did booksellers buy and commission original works from authors, they also commissioned and employed bookbinders, selling the finished volumes in their own and others' retail shops. If you were a novelist trying to make a living, it was then and now tough. Many of these 17th and 18th century booksellers worked in syndicates in which they shared printing and binding costs, topped up each other's stock at special rates, and did everything they could to maximize their profits. They also avoided bidding against each other so they could buy authors' copyrights as cheaply as possible. You can hear the plaintive voice of Aphra Behn in a letter she wrote to the bookseller Jacob Tonson in 1683. Tonson planned to publish a volume of her poems, which included a verse translation from the French called A Voyage to the Island of Love. Aphra Behn had hoped to get £30 for her work, but Tonson was only offering 20. She wrote, quote, "As for those verses of mine, I should really have thought them worth £30, and I hope you will find it worth 25. Not that I should dispute at any other time for £5, where I'm so obliged, but you cannot think what a pretty thing the island will be. And if that pleases, I will do the second voyage, which will compose a little book as big as a novel by itself. But pray, to advance the price to £1 more." We hear something of the same note in Jane Austen's 1812 letter, announcing the sale of the copyright of Pride and Prejudice to the bookseller Thomas Egerton. Quote, "P&P is sold. Egerton gives £110 for it. I would rather have had 150, but we could not both be pleased." Jane Austen sidestepped some of her disappointment by adding, "I am not at all surprised that he should not choose to hazard so much." Aphra Behn was a pioneer for women authors in commerce, with Jane Austen one of her many distant beneficiaries. By Jane Austen's time, female authorship, especially of novels, was well established, with William Lane's Minerva Press alone publishing an average of at least a dozen novels by women per year during its heyday in the 1790s, not to mention the majority of the horrid novels listed in Northanger Abbey. It wasn't just authors against whom booksellers colluded. Printers were hard to pressure because there weren't as many of them. They owned expensive equipment, but bookbinders didn't need expensive equipment, and there were lots of them. They were at the bottom of the economic pecking order, and booksellers did their best to keep them that way. An 18th century writer summed it up. The bookbinder is a dependent on the bookseller. He receives the book in sheets from the bookseller, and his business is to bind it as he is directed. The profit of the trade is but inconsiderable in itself. How inconsiderable is shown by a bookbinder's wholesale price list from Aphra Behn's time, which states that a binder would be paid 8d for a simple calf binding on something like Aphra Behn's novel, 1688 novel, Oruniko, or the book mentioned in her letter, Poems with a Voyage to the Island of Love, 1684. Or if the buyer was willing to pay for something a little more upscale, booksellers would probably have in stock a binding like this, with more decoration on the covers and a gilt spine. Now, I've shown you a couple of basic bindings. We'll get back to them, but I want to digress a moment about book formats and sizes. I read you the letter from the German referring to the poorest duodecimo. The duodecimo, or 12mo, means a single printed sheet folded to make 12 leaves, usually around 6.5 by 4 inches. This became the standard format for novels in the 18th and early 19th century, although Aphra Behn's poems and novels from the 1680s were octavos, an inch or more taller by virtue of the sheet being folded to make 8 leaves. And so were later novels by other well-known authors who could command more for their manuscripts and whose books sold at higher prices, like Defoe and Swift and de la Rivière Manley in the earlier part of the 18th century. Towards the end of that century, the sheet size for novels got bigger and duodecimo novels started to look more like octavos. Don't be fooled. It's the formatting or folding of the sheet that determines whether it's octavo or a duodecimo. As far as pricing books went, the bookseller paid the binder 8d for the basic binding in calf, on the Aphra Behn example, and sold the book for 2 shillings and 6pence. If the binder put on more decoration, as you see here in a gilt spine, both he and the bookseller would charge another 6pence or so. It's worth remembering that the 2 shillings and 6pence someone paid for Aphra Behn's poems in 1684 was a full day's wages for many skilled craftsmen. And 130 years later, Jane Austen's novels were sold in their fragile boards from 15 to 24 shillings a set. If you were an ordinary sailor on one of Jane Austen's Naval Brothers ships, you earned 22 shillings and 6pence a month, enough to buy Emma at 21 shillings, but not enough for Northanger Abbey and Persuasion at 24. To complicate bookbinding matters a bit further, authors and booksellers usually produced a few copies in deluxe goatskin bindings, called Turkey in Behn's time and Morocco later, reflecting the geographical sources of the skins. Goatskin was enormously more expensive, and its cost was never reflected in the bookbinder's price lists I mentioned. True goatskin would have been at least 4 or 5 times as expensive as calf. And as far as I can tell, none of the original printings of Aphra Behn's novels have survived in anything but simple leather bindings. But if she or her booksellers had produced deluxe bindings on her novels, they would have looked something like this, most of the time in red or black. And while these bindings might well have been called Turkey, quite often they seem to have been made from the skins of the sheep breed known as hair sheep, which took color stains almost as well as goatskin and was much less expensive. And of course, whether the special bindings were true goatskin or the cheaper dyed sheep, authors had to foot the bill for the ones presented to patrons. It's recorded that Jane Austen had to pay 24 shillings, 8 shillings a volume, for the binding on the special copy of Emma in red Morocco she presented to the Prince Regent. And I apologize for the poor quality of this image. It was the only one I could find. I want to tell you one more story about a novel before I start showing more bindings. It's recounted in the diary of Samuel Pepys. And the novel was in fact French pornography. Pepys normally bought his books in gilt bindings, but this time he broke his own rule. Here's how he put it in the diary. Thence away to the Strand to my bookseller's, and there stayed an hour and bought that idle, roguish book, L'Escole des Filles, which I have bought in plain binding, avoiding the buying of it better bound, because I resolve, as soon as I've read it, to burn it, that it may not stand in the list of my books, nor among them, to disgrace them if it should be found. I'll say no more than that the diary says Pepys read L'École des Filles, the girls' school, straight through in what might discreetly be called a state of high excitement, and that he duly burned it the next day. There are a lot of interesting inferences one can make from this diary entry, and I'm not going near any of them. What matters to me is that phrase about the binding, which would have looked something like this, and which tells us something essential about the way the book trade worked in his time and later. Pepys bought the book in plain binding because he planned to burn it. He avoided the buying of it better bound, from which clearly the proper inference is that he could have bought it better bound, that copies were available in the shop on the day Pepys went shopping in more than one binding style. Better bound suggests a hierarchy of bindings, and so it was in Pepys's time and later. A good example of the hierarchy of bindings that could be had a century later comes from a high-end London bookseller named John Stockdale. Stockdale published his share of novels and would have sold most of them in simple bindings. But in 1785, Stockdale specifically advertised his single-volume works of Shakespeare on fine royal paper as available for sale in a wide variety of bindings. From cheapest to most expensive, there were boards at 15 shillings, which wouldn't have been all that different to those we've already seen on Sense and Sensibility. Different styles of calf, vellum. Here's a sad survival of it, but you can see the gilt spine, which would have been very handsome at the time. Morocco extra, which is goatskin, as I mentioned earlier, the extra means extra gilt, and tortoise shell, at most expensive of all at 3 guineas, which would have looked something like this. If Pepys could walk into a shop and buy pornography in more than one binding style in 1668, it's hard to imagine that a classy bookseller like Stockdale wouldn't have had all his specifically advertised styles available for one-stop shopping. Having outlined the overall functioning of the English book trade and the variety of bindings available in shops for purchase, let's take a look at the progression of bindings on novels. Aphra Behn's novels, which from the 1690s on were collected in volumes like this, were, as I mentioned earlier, most likely to be found in bindings of plain calf or paneled calf. A demonstrable instance of the hierarchy of bindings on an English novel comes a bit later, on these 2 octavo volumes of de la Rivière Manley's Roman à Clef, Secret Memoirs and Manners of Several Persons of Quality, of both sexes from the New Atlantis. Next slide there. Respectively published in the spring and fall of 1709, and these copies purchased in 1710. It makes sense that the bindings are different as the 2 volumes were published at different times. But there's more to it than that. Booksellers and syndicates of booksellers used any number of individual bookbinders in order to meet publication deadlines. So unless books were produced as sets, like this Plutarch from 1693, a bookseller could have bindings on the shelves which were the work of any number of different binders. What's interesting about these 2 volumes of the New Atlantis is not just that they're in different bindings for the same owner, but that the owner wrote in the prices paid, displaying the binding hierarchy and the extra amount paid for the one with the added gilding. 4 shillings total for the gilt book, as opposed to 3 and 6pence for the plain one, which had only a simple gilt title label on the spine. In the context of these 2 different bindings, it's also worth taking a second look at this sample from Samuel Pepys's library. Pepys was willing to pay to get the gilt spines, but note that none of the spine gilding is identical. The style is the same, extra gilt from the late 17th century, but the actual tools and lettering used on each spine is different. Most bookbinders of the period were as comfortable having their books look different as modern buyers are with having different dust jackets on their shelves. You saw the paneled style with decorative ink sprinkles on the cheaper volume of Manley's Atlantis. That style became widespread after 1680 and remained so into the 1720s. Here it is on this uniformly bound set of Rabelais' works in English, published in 1708. Now, I mentioned that lots of different binders could work on the same publication. Another efficiency of the trade system was that bookbinders not only bound books, but also warehoused them. This warehousing system meant that sheets of books could be distributed to different binders who prepared copies towards an agreed publication date, with the remaining unbound sheets warehoused for binding and delivery to retail shops at short notice as the ready-bound stocks were depleted. As a result, even the most ordinary binding patterns would show variations depending on the journeyman who bound a particular copy. The system also meant that each retail bookseller had to decide how many copies of an edition were likely to be sold right away and order from the warehouseman bookbinders accordingly. Too few copies bound could mean losing customers. Too many meant money tied up in the expensive bindings over and above the wholesale cost of the unsold books sheets. All these factors contribute to why you so rarely see exact duplicates of bindings on English hand press era books. Duplicates or twins exist, but consider the mathematics. First, your average 18th century novel likely had an edition of 500 copies. Some would be bound by different binders for the commissioning publisher or publishers and distributed to smaller retailers. Others would go unbound to retailers with their own book binders. An individual journeyman binder would have been unlikely to turn out more than, say, 25 copies. which means at least 20 binders at work. Now consider that your average duodecimo novel of the period doesn't survive in more than 10 or 15 copies, with usually the majority of them rebound. The odds of identical surviving copies aren't quite vanishing, but are certainly at least 100 to 1. The identically tooled red and black bindings I showed you earlier are among the handful of twin bindings I've seen in 40 years or so of looking. So let's not worry too much about finding consistent patterns in these book bindings, and instead consider the development of their overall structure and materials. In the first half of the 18th century, duodecimo novels were normally priced 2 shillings and 6pence per volume. When their bindings had any gilt on the covers, it often looked like this, a simple double fillet around the edges. But it's important to remember that there weren't hard and fast patterns for the evolution of styles. Binders sold their tools, which were reused by a later generation, or they got old and kept working in the old-fashioned ways they were used to. In the 1730s, financial pressures made for further economies in basic bindings for novels. Ordinary sheepskin with its coarser grain had always been about half the price of calf, and it shows up more and more. Here's an example on Jane Barker's entertaining novels, 2 volumes, 1736, which are sprinkled but otherwise undecorated, with just the simplest of gilt lines and labels on the spines. It cost 5 shillings bound for the pair and said so on its title page. The advertisements at the end offered Eliza Haywood's novels in 4 neat pocket volumes at the same per volume price, 10 shillings the set, or 2 and 6pence a volume. During the 1740s, with the expansion of novel publishing, booksellers kept the per volume price for duodecimo novels the same, but they cut back even more on what you got for your money. 2 shillings and 6pence became the standard for what was referred to as sewed, and you had to pay 3 shillings per volume to get that neat pocket volume described in the advertisement for Eliza Haywood's novels. Here's a set of Samuel Richardson's Pamela from 1742, which exemplifies sewed, which is to say in wrappers, although sewed also came to be applied to covers of plain cardboard. And here's what 3 shillings per volume bound got you. During the same decade, bookbinders increasingly used cheaper paper on the covers of bindings, a style which became known as half-bound. Here's a set of Henry Fielding's Miscellanies, 1743, which includes his novel Jonathan Wild the Great, in the cheapest possible leather binding, sheep with marbled paper covers, and no decoration except the volume numbers on the spine. And here's the same set in full calf. The Miscellanies aren't duodecimos, but full-sized octavos, and it's obvious enough to say that the larger a book got, the more likely it was that a bookbinder would save money by using paper on the covers. Smaller novels in the 1740s and 50s usually still got full leather bindings. Here's Tom Jones from 1749, although I'm not sure that the spine labels are exactly that date. They might be 20 or 30 years later. And also a Dublin Tom Jones, also 1749, where printers compressed the 6 volumes of the London edition to 3 and bound it in this economical, simple, sprinkled calf, with the spine labels incorporating the volume numbers, so they didn't have to be separately stamped on the bindings, but could be produced entirely separately from the binding of the books and applied later. Needless to say, these kinds of economies meant that the Dublin booksellers could substantially undercut the prices of London editions, and London booksellers were able to obtain a prohibition on the importation to Britain of these cheaper but Dublin productions. I don't have time to go into detail here about these and other developments in the marketing and circulation of books, but I can't fail to mention the development of circulating libraries, which from the 1740s onwards spread to every provincial town in England. These libraries, which rented books out by the day or week, needed durable but also the cheapest possible bindings. Here's an example of their plain leather-backed boards from later in the century on George Monk Barclay's novel, Maria or the Generous Rustic, 1784. Now back to our chronology. This is a typical mid-1750s binding. In a standard decorative style you'd see both earlier and later in the century. It's on a 1755 novel called Memoirs of the Shakespeare's Head in Covent Garden, in which are introduced many entertaining adventures by the ghost of Shakespeare. And here are the first two volumes of Sterne's Tristram Shandy from 1760. Have a look where the second spine label is chipped, showing the absence of a gilt rule where the label had been, demonstrating that the labels were meant to be integral to the binding. You can also see that the binder, or his finisher so called because there were special employees in some binderies who only did the final decorations, misnumbered the spines and had to go back and redo them. There also began to appear in the 1760s a kind of cloth binding that was another saving for booksellers, especially on their cheapest books. The cloth was canvas, mostly used on school books, hence its name school cloth. But here it is on a 1761 novel. Note the price, only 1 shilling. The last years of the 1760s saw significant developments in the micro world of English bookbindings. Shortages of leather became acute, prices went up even more, and the shift to cheaper bindings accelerated. In May 1768, an advertisement in the London Chronicle encouraged, quote, gentlemen to have their books done up in boards or sewed in blue paper as a means of restraining the exorbitant and repeated rise in the price of leather. These pressures certainly contributed to the Newbery firm's introduction around 1768 of its bindings in the vellum manner, a small piece of stained, usually green vellum with paper covers. These may have been vellum scraps because they were almost exclusively used on smaller children's books, including novels. The modern Newbery Children's Book Medal was named for this bookseller. This vellum manner continued unchanged into the early 19th century. What you see here is from the 1790s on Edward Augustus Kendall's novel, The Sparrow. One of the consequences of this supply chain crisis in the late 1760s was that advertisements for novels began to drop the 3 shillings bound, retaining only the 2 shillings and 6pence sewed for standard size novels. This allowed booksellers to price their newly leather-bound stock as the market permitted. Offering books in boards and wrappers became even more widespread when in the spring of 1786, more than 80 London journeyman bookbinders went on strike to seek a reduction in their working hours from 14 to 13 per day, 6 days a week. One of the strikers indignantly reported that binderies were using women and apprentices to put printed sheets in boards, further increasing their sale at the expense of leather bindings. Once the strike was settled, many booksellers saw an opportunity to raise prices on novels in boards, making 3 shillings per volume the standard price. And that price didn't last long. William Lane, who added Minerva Press to his imprint towards the end of 1790, started moving up from 3 shillings during that decade. He'd reached 4 shillings by 1800 or so, and 5 shillings, which was also the per volume price for Sense and Sensibility, by 1810. Printed paper labels were used forgive me. Printed paper labels were used on Newbery's vellum manner spines from the late 1760s and spread to most novels later, becoming more and more standard by 1800. Sometimes, especially by the teens and after, the labels also included prices. You can see that 24 shillings at the bottom of these on Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. None of this meant that you couldn't walk into a bookshop and buy a novel in a leather binding. It seems likely that sewed or boards had become the predominant way novels were initially sold. But because leather-bound copies are so much more likely to survive, we'll probably never be able to prove the point one way or the other. But I'll remind you that the image I showed earlier of the interior of James Lackington's bookshop around 1795 showed walls covered with leather bindings. And here's another shop of the same decade, which clearly also displays bound, not boarded books. As prices for leather-bound novels became less standardized, so did their look. Here are varying degrees of elegance on calf in a selection of novels published between 1773 and 1800 and arranged chronologically from left to right. And here's a survival where it seems likely a single bookseller was offering something like a uniform look on novels by two different authors, or else providing multiple titles in a specified style for a particular customer. More fine bindings also began to appear on novels. These deluxe bindings were always a small percentage, and some of their increase in numbers was certainly due to the gentry and even aristocrats taking up novel writing. Well-to-do writers wanted their works to show to the best advantage. Here's a fine Morocco binding on Lady Cassandra Hawkes, Julia de Gramont, 1788. At least two other copies identically bound to this one survive, suggesting one particular fine binding turning out copies for presentation and possibly for sale as well. And here's Charlotte Smith's Montalbert, 1795, a precursor of the kind of binding you saw in Jane Austen's presentation copy of Emma to the Prince Regent. Or if we really want a candy cane, have a look at Mary Barker's A Welsh Story, 1798, in the copy presented to the book's dedicatee, the Duchess of York. Or a pink and green Spinster's Tale from 1801, this last more likely than not a continental binding, which just adds one more wrinkle to this historical tapestry. I'm going to finish in a minute with an image of bindings on Jane Austen first edition sold in the very recent past. But first, I wanted to toss out a couple of thoughts on the 19th century. You'll all know the story of Richard Bentley's republication of Jane Austen's novels in 1833, just after what we usually think of as the hand press era. The Bentley editions were sold most cheaply in cloth. The 1833s looked like this. But you could perfectly well find a bookseller's shop where you could buy a ready-bound set that looked like this. And you could take it home with you and ruin your eyes on its small type. And publishers continued to advertise different binding styles at different prices right through the 19th century, as on Macmillan's publication of Jane Austen's from the 1890s, where the cloth elegant on the left seems to have cost either 1 6 or 2 shillings more than the binding without the gilt. But I said I'd conclude with an image of Jane Austen first editions, and here it is, courtesy of Dominic Winter Book Auctions in England. These were sold at auction this past December, the property of the descendant of the collector who bought them in the 1970s and 80s. Austen novels were much cheaper then. This clutch reported to have cost the collector a total of about £5,000. And in December, they sold for a total of £181,000, with the Pride and Prejudice alone going for £92,000. Now that we've looked at so many original bindings on novels of the hand press period, let's take a look at these. The auctioneer got the binding descriptions absolutely right, I should add, and I'm doing no more than summarizing them here. Take a look at these 5 sets and draw your own conclusions, going from left to right. And then I'll be happy to answer questions. So first, on the left, Sense and Sensibility. These are modern spines and labels. The covers, which you don't see, are old and probably, but not necessarily original. Pride and Prejudice. This may not be a binding absolutely contemporary with publication, but it's awfully close. Date stamping at the foot of bindings, if you look at the bottom, you can see the London and the date. Date stamping at the foot of bindings was uncommon in 1813, but not unheard of. Mansfield Park is absolutely contemporary, a basic half leather. The paper numbers on the spines could well be from a circulating library, but some private owners put numbers on spines to keep their shelves organized. Emma is in a very late 19th or early 20th century binding, and Northanger Abbey and Persuasion is showing its original spines, but they've been removed and pasted back down over a modern leather rebacking. Thank you for listening and watching, and now to your questions.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was just fascinating, Stuart.
Thank you.
And I'm sure our audience felt the same. We already have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, but if you have a question for Stuart Bennett, please feel free to continue putting your questions in the Q&A box so that we can ask him them live. So I'm going to start off. We have a couple questions. I'm going to combine these two. They're both about vellum. And specifically, what was the vellum made out of? What was this very cheapest vellum that you kind of mentioned made of? And is it similar to the type that was used in the medieval manuscripts that we might be a little bit more familiar with the use of vellum?
Yes, I mean, vellum was the inside of animal skin, and the ones mostly used were either calf or sheep. And the sheep had a coarser grain to it, just as the outsides had a coarser grain to it. And essentially, it's the same thing that was used for, an illuminated manuscript on vellum. Probably for bookbinding, cut a little thicker. My eyes sometimes think that they can discriminate between sheep vellum, which is sometimes called parchment, and calf vellum, which is called vellum. But the terms are quite often interchanged, and I confess that quite often I can't tell the difference.
Thank you.
One of our viewers are asking also if you could say a little bit more about how book subscriptions worked.
Well, book subscriptions were essentially a way to, to get money up front before publishing a book. The process was revolutionized by Alexander Pope, who was unhappy with the offers he was getting for the copyright of his translation of Homer. So he went and took subscriptions himself. And they were published that way by, I think, Bernard Lintott. And their authors sort of became aware that if you had enough of an acquaintance and enough patronage, you could raise your own subscriptions. And I think that this was a way later in the century for some authors who were trying to make a living. They would raise subscriptions, get money in advance to commission the publication of books, because then, as now, there were publishers, or to use the older term, booksellers, who weren't willing to publish unless their costs of publication were covered. Is that addressing enough of the question?
Maybe what the benefits would be for those who subscribed.
I think that probably there might have been some kind of a discount for subscribers' copies, but I haven't seen any real evidence of it. I think subscription was more a way of supporting an author, and particularly in the last decade of the 18th century and into the 19th, there are certainly instances where destitute war widows would get subscriptions for their publications, and very likely there were subscribers who appear in the subscribers list who said, I'll give you the money, but don't send me the book.
It seems that Jane Austen was very proud of being on the subscriber list early on in her career as well.
Well, of course, but it would have got her a copy of Camilla.
Would it have been a bound copy?
It would have almost certainly depended on what Jane Austen paid. That it would have been in 1796 for Camilla. I'm not sure I've ever seen a specific advertisement for it by volume, but it would have been 3 shillings and sixpence, possibly 4 shillings a volume in boards. Mm-hmm. And then you'd have had to pay a bit extra to get it in a leather binding.
Mm-hmm. Another person has a question about sewn signatures. Can you explain that a little bit more? When did the practice of sewing signatures begin, and was something else like glue used before that, or were these bindings hand sewn? Were the signatures hand sewn? Could you just talk a little bit more about the mechanics of the whole?
Yeah, it's what they call forwarding in that you produce the product. Well, certainly the sewing of folded signatures is as old as the codex itself. And because I don't know all that much about book production in the Roman Empire, I'm going to kind of duck that part of it to say that certainly in the English book trade, from the earliest days of printed books being produced in England, the sheets were printed, they were folded quite often. In fact, it seems pretty much a regular practice. The folding and sewing of the sheets, and the sewing was done in a sewing frame, I'll come back to that in a second, was done by women and apprentices. So wives and daughters of bookbinders were roped into this. And there was a frame which was elevated. The signatures were sort of folded over this frame and sewn through, and they were sewn through on cords that were stretched over the frame. So you had the cords, which are what you see in the raised bands on a leather-bound book's spine. And the individual folded signatures were sewn over and around these cords to produce the essentially, the cords dangling over the actual completed pages of the book, which were then beaten flat. Covers were cut to size and applied. The cords holding the sewn signatures were then laced into the boards, and then the glue was applied to the leather to produce the finished product. But with the cords being laced into the boards of the book, in principle, you could produce that book with the boards and the sewing without applying any glue at all. The glue, which kind of consolidated the whole thing, was applied at the time that the leather was put onto the boards and the spine of the book. I'm sure there's a more polished and elegant way to explain that, but I hope I got it across.
No, that was really clear. Thank you.
And it's amazing too. I love how you mentioned the women who were involved with that as well. And one of the great things of this presentation too is that you started with Aphra Behn and ended with Jane Austen. A lot of great women in this talk. We have a question from a viewer who's actually picked up on, I think, very early. Aphra Behn was publishing in the 17th century, right? Mm-hmm. But even much later on, we have cases like the Brontes, who felt obliged to use male names when they were starting to publish. Can you comment perhaps on the market or the practice of women who felt like they had to adopt a male name or perhaps an anonymous name to publish?
Well, I think it's probably a fairly safe guess to say that if you look through the records of, say, publications of novels from, the real blossoming of it in the Regency, or just the 1780-ish on, and I suspect that probably half the novels published anonymously between 1780 and 1820 were by women. I think that and those that weren't, just like Jane Austen, by a lady, and then it became by the author of Sense and Sensibility. But I think that if you gained a certain amount of fame or notoriety, the way de la Riviere Manley did, or the way Eliza Haywood did, and later the way Charlotte Smith and Anne Radcliffe did, then you use your name, because that was a draw. Fanny Burney. I think that, but I think that there persisted a certain societal thing that, nice girls didn't publish novels. So the anonymity.
And it's amazing how long that lasted. I was just thinking too, like George Eliot, there's quite a long history that goes even beyond this time of women adopting that anonymous or those male pen names.
Yeah. Good point.
Not too many men with female pen names.
No.
All right. I have a question about, you mentioned ruining your eyes by reading the small print. And I've noticed lately in the books I've been collecting, tiny fonts. So I was wondering, in terms of choosing you can choose your binding, the papers, many different aspects of the book where you could select by price level. Was there ever any discussion of the font size and readability in the advertising of these books?
Oh, how interesting. Not that I can sort of, parrot right back. But I think that, clearly it was a price determination that, the smaller the font was, the less paper you used, the smaller the book was, the cheaper it could be sold. And I think, we forget, I tried to give an indication of just how expensive books were. Up through Victorian times. I mean, it really, when you think of David Copperfield earning 6 shillings a week, and the novel David Copperfield selling in parts for 1 shilling a volume, with the 19th and 20th parts issued together for 18 pence. That's a lot of money, and of course it was a lot of money to buy Emma for a guinea in boards. So part of what Bentley was doing in 1833 was making it a cheaper, more accessible set.
I've got 2 questions here from viewers about kind of down market binding. One is a question about magazines, like The Spectator or the Ladies Magazine, etc. And would they go through a kind of similar binding process, or were they always sold at, without boards, and then was it the owner who might collect them and bind them? So that's one part. And the other part is somebody wants to know about if, as cheaper cloths board bindings became more popular for novels, was there a cheaper go-to binding for lower quality books like pulp and penny fiction, or I'm thinking like riddle books? just books, that sort of thing?
Sure. Well, to try to deal with the first part, you know, if you bought a magazine, you know, a monthly magazine, you would get essentially a monthly magazine. It would be paper, altogether paper.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were fond of it and you collected all of your individual magazines over a year, or normally they were bound up in annual volumes.
Yeah.
And I think there's no question, but that, for example, the ladies magazine from the later 18th century, you get individual numbers, and people, in the same way that in the 1840s and 50s, people would buy Dickens novels in parts, and they would then go to the binder. The Victorians had it more exact, because it appears that you could go down to your local dealer where you bought your monthly Dickens part, and they'd actually have a prefabricated case that was the binding. So it was simply a matter of having it put in that case. But, you know, for the ladies magazine, for the Spectator, if you were buying the individual numbers, then you would have to take them back to a bookbinder and have them bound. But I think it's almost certainly true that, you know, at the end of year one of the ladies magazine, there would be bound volumes for sale as annual volumes, because there's a standard enough look to them, and also that you see runs of the ladies magazines quite similarly bound, and sometimes identically bound. Now, wait a minute. Was there a second part to that?
The second part was about the down market,
Right.
Lower quality books like pulp and penny fiction, or just books.
Right, and they would basically come in the kind of down market binding that I showed with the school cloth, the canvas. They would come. Jest books would more often than not be bound in the cheapest possible plain sheet, and you get some storybooks, or you get things that were cheaply produced for popular consumption, and that they could include jest books, they could include The Pilgrim's Progress, and they'd be this absolutely unadorned plain sheet, kind of like the picture I showed of the girls' school novel that Pepys bought. And they would be printed on an inferior paper. When you get, when we think of pulp fiction, it wasn't pulped paper that was being used for these low end productions in the 18th century, but it was altogether an inferior paper.
Yeah. Thanks.
So we have a question about the business side of a bookbindery. Did a shopper have a lot of different choices of bookbinders to do the work? Was this like a very competitive business? And how many of those do you know of any binders who started in business, say, in the 18th or early 19th century and are still around today in some form?
None that go back that far. The Victorian bookbinder, Robert Riviere, who began, I think, in the early 1850s, was merged with a bindery in Bath called Behn. And the Behn bindery is still in business, and you can walk down from Central Bath to the railway station, and you'll go down Manvers Street, and you'll see this rather handsome Victorian shop front on your left that says George Behn, and you can actually go in there. There's a bindery at work, and you can commission a bookbinding. That's the longest established bindery I can think of. I'm winging it here, and if somebody can come up with an earlier one, I will happily eat humble pie.
Yeah, it's for our audience. If you guys know of one, be sure to drop that in the chat.
Yeah. So a couple of very material oriented questions here. Why was sheepskin considered to be of less value than cowskin? And whether pig was also used? And how do you differentiate Morocco and Turkish?
Okay, I'll start at the end. They were both Morocco and Turkey were goat skin, but in the 17th century it was mostly sourced from Turkey, and later it was sourced from Morocco, which is why they get their names. But they're both goat skin. The sheep was more readily available and was simply cheaper in the same way it was, cheaper to buy mutton than it was to buy steak. And also the sheepskin wouldn't take gilt decoration. It was coarser. It was a more uneven, slightly, how to describe it? Coarser is really the best I can do. Whereas a well tanned piece of calf could take some really quite elaborate and elegant decoration. Not as elegant as a piece of goat skin, and goat skin was the tip top. And then, as I said, they would use that particular breed of sheep called hair sheep, which was a finer grain. It wasn't as coarse because it had hair instead of wool. So it would take decoration better.
So goat, hair sheep, calf, pig, sheep?
Thank you. You reminded me that I didn't address the pig part of it. Pigskin was used pretty much on the continent, particularly up through the 16th century. You very, very rarely see pigskin on English books. So if you were having a kind of hierarchy, to go back to Stockdale's advertisement, you'd have boards, and then you'd have calf, and then you'd have, and for those who looked carefully at the Stockdale advertisement, there is a mention of something called Russia. Well, Russia is calf skin that had a particular acid dye that made it this wonderful, lustrous honey color. The only problem was that the acid dye that created that beautiful honey color made it fragile. So over the course of a single person's lifetime, the Russia binding would often dry out and the covers would come adrift. But that's pretty much the hierarchy of materials.
Wasn't Morocco also typically red? Was that because did they source it red, or wasn't that also a dye?
It was a dye. Red was red. I think there may have been something at the time, and I'm not an expert on the color, chemicals that were used to color or sources for color in the hand press era. But I suspect that red and black the dyes were more readily available. But you do see blue and green Morocco, and sometimes you'll see a kind of orange, which is called citron. So there are multiple colors available.
Thank you.
I have two more material questions. One is about what sprinkling is. You said some of the covers were sprinkled.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other is about labeling. this person asks, does there seem to be any logic other than price for why a bound book might not have a spine label or labels that gave a title and possibly an author? He says, I think one of the Fielding miscellanies you showed just had volume numbers stamped on the spines.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And I think the only way that I was able to make sense of it going into it and looking, at thousands of books was that there must have been some kind of organization in the wholesale production and distribution of books where the labels were produced to order. I couldn't ever find anything that said specifically you had to pay, tuppence or sixpence more to get a gilt label. But I think there's no doubt that if you had an upscale retail bookshop in the 17th or 18th century, after, when you think of labels came in after the restoration of the monarchy. And were pretty widespread by 1680 or so. Before the English Civil War, most books were actually shelved with the spines into the wall and were identified by writing along the forage of the book. There's anybody who wants an example of that. There's a poet named Cartwright whose works were published in 1651, and he was a considerable scholar. And there's a frontispiece portrait of Cartwright in a library, and I think it's showing his scholarliness that all the books in his library are shelved with the forages out and lettered along the forages. So I think, but to go back to the practice in bookshops, I think that there was probably if you had an upscale bookshop and you were using a particular group of binders, then you would have those binders label your books because you would want them to be on the shelves available. But if you had an order, say, from a bookseller in the provinces who was ordering Fielding's miscellanies, and you were to deliver, X number of copies in the cheapest possible binding, well, you probably didn't have them labeled. You just stamp the volume numbers, put them in that half binding, and ship them off. Now, this is conjecture, but I spent a lot of time reading about the way the bookbinding trade worked and interacted with booksellers, and it's the best I can come up with.
That business about shelving with the spine in is so interesting. A couple of years ago on HGTV, there was a real fad, especially with Chip and Joanna Gaines, for shelving books that way so that you'd get this nice kind of neutral palette along your bookshelves. And right. So it's come back.
Yeah, instead of all those lurid dust jackets.
Yes, exactly.
This is a great transition too, because we have someone who's very interested in foredges and was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about them. Specifically, why so few British books of this era had pictures painted on the edges in relation to continental books?
Pictures in the sense of actual forage paintings or marbling or decorative edges?
I believe the question's probably in reference to forage paintings, particularly the type that might reveal themselves, but any type of forage decoration might also be relevant here. Perhaps you could talk a bit about the different types.
I think probably by the end of the 18th century, the majority of English books had some kind of and I'm about to be able to answer a previous question that I ignored, and I apologize. The sprinkling, which was essentially sprinkles of ink or acid to create an effect on covers of books, and the little black sprinkles you see, they're little black sprinkles of ink, and quite often, with a book, with the edges of a book there were sprinkles or there was some red added to just give it a little bit more flash. A four-edge painting is a separate creature altogether, and was something that certainly existed and would reveal itself in that engaging way. That, but it's also important to point out that there was an enormous trade in the manufacture of four-edge paintings by bookshops in the 20th century. I mean, there was, I think, that Joseph's bookshop in Charing Cross Road actually had a four-edge painter on the top floor, and he cranked them out on 19th century books, which were presented as four-edge paintings. And, over the period of time, who's to say when a four-edge painting was applied to an 1820s or 30s or 40s book? So I think that anyone who's still in the audience considering buying a four-edge painting, think caveat emptor.
So what about other types of four-edge decorations would you find then in this period?
Well, you'll get you get in the deluxe bindings, whether they're hair sheep or almost certainly with goat skin, you will almost never see a goat skin binding from the Restoration period on that doesn't have gilded edges. So gilt edges, you sometimes will see an embossed pattern as well as gilt, in which case the usual way of describing it is gilt and gophered edges, Gauffred. As I said, that you will sometimes get a sprinkle of around the edges. You'll sometimes get red or yellow to just add a little bit more pizzazz. But your simple bindings don't get any of those extras. Does that cover it?
Yes.
I want to thank Linda Trost also for posting the Cartwright's bookshelf. So if anybody wants to see that, it's in the chat. A little bit more on matching bindings and that issue. Someone is asking, so when you go to and visit an estate and you see a old family library, and many of the books have matching or similar bindings, is that because they bought them all from the same seller, or is that because they had them bound afterwards in a uniform way, or are they just more modern than we think?
Well, that last is a possibility, but I was hoping somebody would ask that question, because in the 18th century, particularly in the last half of the 18th century, there were itinerant bookbinders who advertised themselves as binding and beautifying gentlemen's libraries. And what those itinerant bookbinders would do, and that's why I want to back up for a second and say that you when you go into a country house library, and your first impression is of the uniformity of it. But is that first impression because the bindings are all of a period, all executed in the same way? Or, as I've seen in several country house libraries, is it because they've had gilt decoration and or spine labels added that match, so that you'll see in country house libraries, you might see a row of 17th century folios that range from the beginning of the century to the end of the century, and they'll have identical spine labels. I don't mean identical statements on the spine labels, but identical labels that were produced at the same time. And quite a few of these would have been done by the itinerant bookbinders. And I mentioned, when I said I thought the labels on a particular set of Tom Jones that I showed in the talk, that the labels might have been 20 or 30 years later. I think it's quite possible that they were in a country house library in a plain binding, and that they were decorated by an itinerant bookbinder to match the rest. Now, when you get into the Regency, there are at least a couple, and I bet there's somebody in the audience here who's going to remember their names, but of aristocratic women who collected novels, and you see uniform bindings, and I think that there certainly was an availability where you had your London bookseller, and you instructed that London bookseller to send all of your novels to a particular workshop for them to be bound uniformly. And I remember how knocked flat I was when a particular bookseller in Northern England got into a country house library and bought the Regency novels, and it was like a candy shop, because they were in these pastel colors, and one, red and blue and green and orange, and it was just, and they were in perfect condition, and they were 3 and 4 deckers, and they were just absolutely gorgeous, and they were clearly done to order, to match. That's the exception. I like to say that that's the exception that proves the rule, but it simply was an available option.
But they tended to be itinerant or anonymous workshops rather than a customer-facing section of London with binderies, or.
No, it would have, the customer-facing would almost invariably have been the bookseller. There were some grand binders in the Regency period. Charles Herring, there's starting to, Lewis was another one. Lewis bound for a collector named Richard Heber, who said memorably, I thought, that a gentleman should have 3 copies of every book: one to collect, one to read, and one to lend.
Lovely.
And Heber used a particular binder, and there are times when you sort of gnash your teeth, because Heber will put a note in to say where he bought the book, and you realize that he had sent to Charles Lewis for rebinding a book that was in the original vellum. So anyway, but most of the interfacing, so the aristocratic book collector who wanted a pastel show of novels on the shelves, that interface would have been with the bookseller, and the bookseller would have commissioned, because these wouldn't have been the special kind of binders who were working for the rich book collector.
Thank you.
I have a question here from somebody who wants to know about value. Do you know if books would hold their value for resale? So, for instance, when the Reverend Austen sold his library when he moved to Bath, do you have any sense of what the percentage of the original investment he might have
recovered?
What?
Yeah, might have recovered on his. Yeah. He might have gotten a couple of shillings on the pound. I mean, the answer is that people who had to sell their books had to take what they could get, and the book trade was, I like to think, more ruthless then than it is now, but that may be wishful thinking.
Yeah.
No, it was. It wasn't a. When Richard Heber sold up his collection, it didn't fetch what he had paid for it. A lot of what he had paid retail for things, and I'm sure that Reverend Austen's books, which would have been predominantly theology, would not have been thought for. Yeah.
Mhm.
And worse, he would have read them, so they would have looked tired.
Well, I think a lot of them were bound, though. I mean,
Yeah.
because there's a letter where Jane Austen says, you know, now that they've come back from the binder, they fit very nicely into the bookcase.
Oh, how nice. That's a letter I'd like to find.
I'll look for the date for you.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, to finish us off for the evening, can you tell us, this is a little bit more of a personal question, can you tell us what your favorite surprise, find, or discovery has been over your career? I think everyone loved your story about visiting Scotland. What's your favorite incident?
That was pretty near the top. I mean, the thing is in the book trade, there's, one of the things that keeps us going is the hope of stumbling over something wonderful. But I think probably the one that comes to mind immediately after the discovery of the Sense and Sensibility is another story of when I was working at Christie's, and I went out to another country house in Essex, and it had been co-opted by the British Army during World War II. And what had been, so there was what they called the operations room. It was the room co-opted. And there'd been books apparently on the shelves, and the shelves had been torn down. And there were these piles and piles of books. And the day that I went out, it was raining. And I said, well, if I'm going to do this properly, I should have a look at the piles of books in what they called the ops room. And they said, well, just as well then that it was raining, because we were planning to have the bonfire today. And out of that pile of books came the first edition of the first actual published book of photographs. It was Fox Talbot's Sun Pictures in Scotland. And it was complete, and the photographs were in nice condition. And I still remember when it sold for quite a lot of money at auction, the owner and his wife, or the couple who owned the house, were in the sale room, and I said after the sale, well, that was worth finding, wasn't it? And I still remember his voice. He said, "My dear boy." So that was a fun one.
Well, thank goodness you were there.
Well, it does make one feel good.
And I'm sorry that we don't have time to hear about your own novels. I'm very interested in that, but I think Anne is going to share a link to them so we can each explore those on our own.
Well, thank you.
She's done so already. Yeah.
Yes, it's in the chat if you would like to learn more about Stuart's novels.
Well,
which is the most bibliophile of them, or are they all very?
No, I think if for the bibliophile, the one to read is actually my first novel, called A Perfect Visit, which is taken from Jane Austen. I think it's taken from Emma. It was a perfect visit, perfect being much too short.
Right.
And it is essentially, I called it, the working title was a bibliographical romance, and it's essentially a bibliographical fantasy involving, the tired trope of time travel, and I had a wonderful time with it. And
I'm sold. I'm buying it.
Please. It is available. Dare I say it? It is available on Amazon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So seriously, this was a fabulous evening. I know I enjoyed myself. I think everyone in our audience enjoyed themselves. So thank you again, Stuart.